Adrian Vale divorced Elena in less than 10 minutes. No argument, no raised voices, no explanation. The conference room was silent. Thick walls, soft lights, money in the air. Outside, Ravenport moved on like nothing was ending. Inside, everything was. Adrian didn't look at her when he spoke. This marriage is over. His voice was calm, controlled, the same voice that terrified men. He slid the papers across the table like a deal already finished. Elena stared at them, then picked up the pen. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't cry. That hurt more than tears ever could. No reason, she asked quietly. Silence, she signed slowly, carefully. When she stood, she asked the only thing that mattered. Is this really what you want? Adrian met her eyes. Yes, he said. It was a lie. She walked out without looking back. And that was the day the most feared man in Ravenport walked away from the only woman he ever loved. And no one knew why. Adrian Vale didn't do things halfway. That was the first rule everyone in Ravenport learned about him. When he loved, it was quiet. No public gestures, no soft promises spoken out loud. Love to Adrian was protection. It was control. It was making sure the world never touched what belonged to him. And when he ended things, it was final. No second chances, no loose ends. Elena learned that early in their marriage. Loving Adrian meant accepting silence as a language. It meant understanding that what he didn't say mattered more than what he did. He never explained where he went at night. Never justified the danger that followed him like a shadow. And Elena never asked. That was the balance. He held the power. She held the trust. So when he looked at her across that polished table and said, "This marriage ends today," she didn't beg. Begging was useless against a man who had already decided. Instead, she searched his face. Not for anger, not for cruelty, but for cracks, for hesitation, for anything human beneath the iron calm. She found none. The power imbalance between them had always been there. Adrian had money, influence, fear working in his favor. Elena had chosen him anyway, knowing she would never fully stand on equal ground, but she had believed naively that love made them partners. In that room, she realized something painful. Love hadn't changed the balance at all. Adrian sat back in his chair, shoulders relaxed, posture dominant without effort. He looked like a man closing a chapter, not losing his wife. The lawyer barely spoke. He didn't need to. Adrian Vale's presence filled the room completely. Elena stood on the opposite side of the table, smaller, quieter, and suddenly aware of how alone she was. Still, she didn't cry. She asked one thing, the only thing that mattered. Is this really what you want? It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an accusation. It was a door left barely open. Adrian didn't meet her eyes. That should have told her everything. Yes, he said. One word, clean, sharp, final. That was the lie. Because if he had looked at her, if he had let himself see her face for more than a second, the truth would have spilled out. He would have told her that wanting had nothing to do with it, that this wasn't about choice or freedom or love dying. It was about survival. But Elena didn't know that. All she knew was that the man who once held her like she was fragile now couldn't even look at her. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet decisions made without consent. Sometimes it's choosing for someone else because you believe you know better. Adrian had done that his entire life. He decided who lived, who fell, who stayed close, and who had to be pushed away. And now he had decided for Elena. She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his answer. Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm. Okay, she said. That word hurt him more than shouting ever could, because it meant she accepted it. She gathered her coat, her bag, the small pieces of a life she had built around him. Adrian watched every movement, memorizing them like a man about to lose something forever. When she reached the door, she paused, not to beg, not to threaten, just to say, "I trusted you." Then she walked out. Adrian stayed behind, surrounded by power, wealth, control, and a silence that felt heavier than any enemy he had ever faced. Because for the first time, his power had cost him the one thing he couldn't replace. Adrian didn't divorce Elena because he stopped loving her. That was the lie the city would believe. The simple story, the one people always told themselves about powerful men. That they grew bored. That they replaced love the way they replaced cars or suits. The truth was darker. He divorced her because loving her was about to get her killed. But Elena never knew that. 2 nights before the divorce, Adrian stood alone in his private office, the lights low. The city stretched out beneath him like a living map of enemies. Ravenport looked peaceful from above. That was the illusion. Underneath, everything was shifting. The warning came from a man Adrian trusted with his life. "She is being mentioned," the man said quietly. "Your wife, not directly, but enough." Enough was all it took. Adrian didn't ask questions. He already knew the rules. The moment a weakness was identified, it became leverage. The moment Elena's name entered certain conversations, she was no longer safe. Love was no longer a private thing. It was a target. Adrian dismissed the man and poured himself a drink he didn't touch. His reflection stared back at him in the glass window. Calm, controlled, ruthless. A man built to survive this world. Elena wasn't. That was the problem. She had never been meant for the violence that followed him. She didn't know how many deals had been made in rooms without windows. How many decisions ended lives quietly. She believed in order, in consequences, in the idea that people eventually paid for what they did. Adrian knew better. That night he watched Elena sleep. He stood in the doorway, hands clenched, memorizing her, like a man about to lose something precious. The rise and fall of her chest, the way her hair spilled across the pillow, the softness of a life untouched by blood. If they came for her, they wouldn't hesitate. They wouldn't negotiate. And Adrian wouldn't be able to protect her. Not without turning her into something she never agreed to become. So he made a decision. Not as a husband, as a man who understood war. Divorce was the only move that made sense. A clean cut, no shared homes, no public attachment. No reason for enemies to believe she still mattered. If she hated him, that was acceptable. If she walked away forever, that was the cost. What mattered was that she stayed alive. The next morning, Elena noticed the distance immediately. Adrian was colder, sharper, more closed off than usual. She thought it was stress. She thought it would pass. She didn't know he had already begun erasing her. He removed her name from accounts, changed security protocols, redirected attention elsewhere. Within 48 hours, Elena Cross no longer existed in Adrian Vale's world on paper, only in his chest. When he sat across from her during the divorce, every word he spoke was chosen to push her away. Every silence was intentional. Every refusal to explain was an act of protection, disguised as cruelty. He needed her to believe he didn't love her, because love would make her look back, and looking back was dangerous. What Adrian didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Elena was carrying something far more fragile than herself. A life that tied them together no matter how far he pushed her away. A truth that would surface months later in the worst possible way. But for now, all Elena knew was that her husband had ended their marriage without warning. And all Adrian knew was that the one reason he divorced her might still not be enough to save her. Because in Ravenport, fate never asked permission, and love, real love, always left a trail. They met at a private charity event on a winter night, when Ravenport was wrapped in cold and glassy lights. Elena was working the event, not as a guest, not as someone looking to be seen. She wore a simple black dress, hair pulled back, moving between tables with quiet efficiency. She didn't belong to Adrian's world and she wasn't trying to. That was the first thing that caught his attention. Men like Adrian Vale were used to reactions, fear, admiration, calculation. People leaned in when he spoke. They watched his hands. They tried to measure him. Elena didn't. When he thanked her for refilling his drink, she nodded politely and walked away without a second glance. No smile meant to impress. No curiosity about who he was. Adrian watched her go, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. She wasn't impressed by his power. That's why he noticed her. He found a reason to cross her path again that night. Then another. Their conversations were short at first. Ordinary, safe, weather, music, the city. She never asked what he did for a living. Most people did within minutes. When he finally asked her why, she shrugged and said, "If you wanted me to know, you'd tell me." That answer stayed with him. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, like two people aware that moving too fast could break something fragile. Adrian set rules early, unspoken but clear. He would disappear some nights. There would be things he couldn't explain. There were questions she shouldn't ask. Elena accepted them without drama, not because she was naive, because she understood boundaries. She had grown up learning that some truths weren't hers to carry. Loving Adrian meant trusting what he chose to give and respecting what he kept. In return, he gave her consistency. He showed up when he promised. He never lied when he did speak. He protected her without making her feel owned. When he touched her, it was careful. Like he was constantly aware of how easily this could all be taken away. They didn't live in illusions. They lived in moments. Mornings when he made coffee and said little. Evenings when she read on the couch while he worked in silence nearby. A life built not on grand declarations, but on presence. Elena never tried to change him. She never asked him to be softer than he was. And Adrian never tried to pull her into his darkness. That balance made it work. When they married, there was no fairy tale wedding, just a quiet ceremony, minimal guests, no headlines. Elena wore a simple dress. Adrian didn't smile much, but his hand never left hers. For a while, peace felt possible. But rules only work until the world decides to test them. Adrian's nights grew longer, the silences heavier. Elena noticed the shift before he did. She sensed the tightening of his jaw, the way he stood closer to windows, the way his phone never left his side. Still, she didn't ask because that was the rule. What she didn't know was that the same rules protecting their love were also hiding its expiration date. When danger finally crept close enough to touch her life, Adrian didn't bend the rules, he broke the marriage. And Elena, who had trusted silence for so long, never realized that the one time she should have asked was the night everything changed. Because love under rules can survive almost anything except fear. 2 weeks before the divorce, Elena found out she was pregnant. The test sat on the bathroom counter like a quiet miracle she wasn't ready to touch. She stared at it for a long time, her hands resting on the sink, her reflection pale but steady, positive. The word echoed in her head, soft and unreal. A child, Adrian's child. Her first instinct was to smile, the second was fear, because nothing about their life was simple anymore. She pressed a hand to her stomach, still flat, still secret, and whispered, "Okay." Not to the test, to the life already beginning inside her. She told herself she would wait. One more day, one calm moment. She wanted to tell him when he wasn't distracted, when his guard was down, when his eyes still softened when he looked at her. That moment never came. That same night, Elena woke to voices not raised, not urgent, controlled. The kind of voices that didn't belong in a home built on silence and trust. She pulled on a robe and moved toward Adrian's office, stopping just short of the door when she realized she wasn't alone in the hallway. The door was partially open. Inside, Adrian stood with 2 men she didn't recognize. Their suits were dark, their posture alert, not guests. Elena stayed still, heart pounding. "It's becoming a problem," one of the men said quietly. Adrian didn't respond right away. Elena crossed, the man continued. "Your wife," her name came up. Elena's breath caught. "That name needs to disappear," Adrian said. His voice was calm. But there was something sharp underneath it. Dangerous. "The offer's already been made," the man replied. "Not official, but the message is clear." "How much?" Adrian asked. There was a pause, then a number. Elena felt the world built, a price on her life. She backed away slowly, silently, every muscle locked in place. Her hands shook as she returned to the bedroom, closing the door with care, leaning against it as her legs threatened to give out. She pressed both hands to her mouth to stop herself from making a sound. Adrian didn't know she had heard, and she wasn't going to tell him. Because in that moment, Elena understood something terrible and clear. She wasn't just Adrian's wife, she was leverage. And now she was pregnant. Telling him would change everything. It would tie him to her even tighter, make him reckless, force him to choose between protecting his empire and protecting his family. Elena had lived with Adrian long enough to know what he would choose. He would burn the world down, and she couldn't let him do that. Not for her, and not for a child that deserved a life without blood attached to its name. So she made a decision. She stayed quiet, she acted normal, she smiled when she needed to. She let him touch her without pulling away. Even though every heartbeat felt louder now, heavier, she began planning without telling anyone. If Adrian pushed her away, she wouldn't fight it. If he ended the marriage, she would accept it. Because walking away might save him, and staying might get them all killed. The night Adrian brought up the divorce, Elena already knew what was coming. She just didn't know how much it would hurt. And as she signed the papers days later, carrying his child and his silence inside her, Elena understood the truth of sacrifice. Sometimes love isn't staying, sometimes it's leaving, and letting the other person believe it meant nothing. Adrian knew the rival families were closing in long before anyone said it out loud. He could feel it in the city, in the way meetings grew tense, in the way old alliances suddenly needed reassurance, in the way men who once spoke freely now chose their words carefully. Ravenport was tightening around him. And in that kind of pressure, only one thing ever mattered: weakness. Adrian had spent his life eliminating his own. He had no addictions, no reckless habits, no emotional tells in public except Elena. She was the one place he let his guard down. The one name that could stop him mid-sentence. The one face that could still reach him when nothing else could. That made her dangerous. Not to him, to everyone else. The moment her name surfaced in those conversations, Adrian knew the rules had changed. It wasn't a question of if someone would try to use her. It was when. And when that happened, there would be no warnings, no second chances. So Adrian did the only thing that made sense in a world built on survival. He erased her. He started quietly. He removed her from security routes, changed schedules, cut access, made sure her name no longer appeared beside his in any place that mattered. Then he did the hardest part. He chose cruelty over honesty, because honesty would have made her stay, and staying would have killed her. Divorce wasn't abandonment. It was a shield. The papers were drafted with precision. No delays, no shared assets that would keep her tied to him. He made sure the settlement was generous enough that no one would question it, but distant enough that it looked like indifference. Every detail was designed to send one message. She doesn't matter anymore. Adrian hated himself for how convincing he had to be. The night before the divorce, he sat alone in his car outside their home, watching the lights in the windows. Elena moved through the space like she always did, calm, unaware, still trusting. He almost went inside, almost told her everything, almost ruined the plan. But he had seen what happened to men who hesitated. He had buried them. So he stayed where he was and let the lie grow roots. At the table during the divorce, every instinct in him screamed to explain, to tell her she was the only reason he was still breathing, that everything he was doing was for her. Instead, he kept his voice flat, his eyes distant. He made her believe she meant nothing. That was the lie that saved him. Because if Elena believed he didn't care, she would leave cleanly. She wouldn't look back. She wouldn't stay connected to a world that would tear her apart the moment it saw an opening. Adrian absorbed her anger in silence, her disappointment, her quiet acceptance. Each one was a cut, but cuts healed. Death didn't. What Adrian didn't know, what he couldn't see through his careful calculations, was that Elena was carrying more than his name. She was carrying his future, a future that couldn't be erased with paperwork. As weeks passed after the divorce, Adrian watched from a distance, making sure the lie held. No contact, no protection tied directly to him, no visible concern. From the outside, it looked like a clean break. Inside, it was a constant war because the lie that saved him from losing her was slowly destroying him instead, and fate was already preparing the moment when that lie would no longer be enough. 6 months passed. Ravenport didn't slow down for heartbreak. If anything, it grew sharper, louder, more dangerous, and Adrian Vale leaned into it with everything he had. He buried himself in control and violence. Meetings multiplied, enemies disappeared. Alliances were reinforced with fear instead of trust. Adrian became colder, more efficient, more ruthless than ever before. Men who worked under him noticed the change. They didn't ask why. They were grateful it wasn't aimed at them. At night he slept less. When he did, Elena found him anyway, standing in doorways, sitting on the edge of the bed they no longer shared, looking at him with questions he could never answer. He woke from those dreams with his jaw tight and his hands clenched, reminding himself why this had to be done. She's safe, he told himself. She's far away. That belief became a ritual, a shield he repeated. Every time the ache in his chest threatened to slow him down. Every time he passed a place she would have liked, every time he reached for his phone without thinking, losing her hurt. But losing her alive was better than losing her dead. Adrian refused to let himself wonder where she had gone. Knowing too much created patterns. Patterns could be followed, so he kept his distance, trusting the systems he put in place to keep her untouched. From the outside, it looked like he had moved on. From the inside, everything was hollow. Elena, meanwhile, built a quiet life out of necessity. She moved to the edge of the city, far from the districts tied to Adrian's name. A smaller apartment, fewer lights, fewer questions. She kept her head down and her routine simple. Her body changed slowly, then all at once. Each morning she reminded herself that this was the right choice, that secrecy was protection, that distance was love in its own way. She never reached out, neither did Adrian. Time passed, and with it the illusion of control grew stronger, until fate stepped in. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. No warning, no dramatic setup, just the kind of moment that changes everything because it's so unremarkable. Adrian was leaving a meeting downtown, irritation already pulling his focus toward the next problem. He moved through the street with purpose, surrounded by security, but lost in thought. Then he stopped, not because of danger, because of recognition. Across the street, outside a small medical clinic, a woman stepped into the sunlight. Elena. For a second, Adrian thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that grief had finally cracked something. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Then she turned slightly and he saw it. Her hand rested instinctively on her stomach. Round, unmistakable. The world went silent. The noise of the street faded. The guards behind him disappeared. There was only Elena standing there, real and close, and carrying something that shattered every lie he had been living with. Pregnant. Adrian's heart slammed against his ribs like it was trying to escape. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't something he could calculate his way out of. Fate had reached into his carefully controlled world and ripped it open in broad daylight. And as Elena looked up, eyes widening the moment she saw him, Adrian knew with terrifying clarity that the past 6 months had only been the calm before something far more dangerous. Because love, once seen again, could never be unseen. He saw her outside a small clinic in South Ravenport. Elena, not the woman he had left behind 6 months ago, the one whose quiet strength had been tempered by fear, the one who had trusted him enough to walk away without fighting. This Elena was different, stronger, sharper, a resilience that only hardship could forge. She stood near the entrance, glancing at her phone, shoulders straight, hair tied loosely back. The sunlight caught her face, highlighting the faint lines that hadn't been there before. Lines that spoke of worry, endurance, and battles fought silently. And then Adrian saw it, her hand resting lightly but protectively over her stomach. Unmistakable, pregnant, carrying their child. For a heartbeat, the world ceased to exist. The car stopped. The chatter of the clinic faded. Even the distant hum of the city seemed muted, as if time itself had bent to his shock. Adrian froze, not out of fear but disbelief. Every calculation he had made, every lie he had lived by, every decision to push her away, it all crumbled in that instant. The careful fortress he had built around his heart had cracks, and now something precious was pressing against them from the inside. Elena looked up, her eyes widened the moment she noticed him. There was no fear, not panic, not relief, just recognition, a flash of something he hadn't seen in months. Hesitation, a silent question. Why was he here? He wanted to speak, to run to her, to demand answers, to shield her from the world again. But he didn't. Instead, he watched, silent, still, calculating, always calculating. Even in moments where logic and emotion tangled so tightly it hurt. She adjusted the coat draped over her shoulders, shielding the curve of her belly. A subtle, instinctive motion that made his chest tighten more than any fist ever could. He remembered the night he had left her, the lie he had forced himself to tell. The act of protection disguised as cruelty. He had believed distance would keep her safe. He had thought erasing her from his life was the only way to save her. And now fate had laughed at his plans. Adrian's mind raced. Questions, fears, and memories collided. Was she safe? Had anyone noticed her? Was she alone? And most pressing of all, how much time had she spent carrying their child in silence? Elena turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the street, then landing back on him. Recognition, confusion, a flicker of pain. For a moment, Adrian felt like a man drowning on dry land. He hadn't allowed himself to hope. Not after the divorce, not after months of silence. Not after convincing himself that this separation was the only way to protect her. And yet here she was, alive, strong, bearing the one thing that bound them together, irrevocably. He wanted to call her name, wanted to cross the street and pull her close, but he couldn't. Not yet. Because even though the world had gone silent for him, he knew the dangers that still lurked, and he couldn't risk them. Not for her. Not for the child he hadn't even held yet. So he stayed, hidden behind shadows and distance, letting her move, letting her live, watching, heart hammering, chest tight, mind racing. And he realized with terrifying clarity that the past 6 months, the divorce, the lies, the sacrifice had only been the prelude. Because now seeing her, knowing the truth, Adrian Vale understood one undeniable fact. Nothing would ever be the same again. Not their love, not their lives, not even the city of Ravenport itself. The world had gone silent. But in that silence, a storm was already building. Adrian told himself it couldn't be his. He had let her go. He had walked away, signed the papers, erased her from his life. She had moved on. She was out there somewhere surviving without him. Stronger, yes, but without any connection to the man who had spent years building empires and shadows alike. And so, in that frozen moment outside the clinic, Adrian clung to that thought like a lifeline. It's not mine, he whispered internally. She isn't mine anymore. It can't be. But the lie lasted exactly 12 seconds. 12 seconds before his instincts betrayed him. Because the way she held her stomach wasn't casual. It wasn't absent-minded, not even a little. It was careful, protective, precise. The same way she had always protected his heart. Always held his trust close. Guarded against the world. Never letting anything or anyone breach that fragile space he had given her. The recognition hit him like a punch to the chest. She wasn't just carrying life. She was carrying their life. Every rational thought Adrian had conjured, the planning, the control, the careful distance, crumpled under that truth. He stepped back into the shadow of an alley across the street, suddenly aware of his surroundings in a way he hadn't been since he first learned how dangerous the city could be. Every movement she made was catalogued in his mind. Every breath, every glance, every subtle shift of weight. She didn't notice him. Not fully. Her focus was elsewhere. Yet every instinct he had screamed that she was his. Still always. Adrian's fingers flexed, his jaw tightened. Control had always been his refuge, power, his shield. But here, none of that mattered. Not when the truth was standing there in plain sight, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time in months, he felt powerless. The denial, that carefully constructed lie, that had kept his heart steady for weeks, evaporated faster than he could hold on to it. It wasn't just her, it wasn't just the pregnancy. It was the realization that no amount of distance, no amount of lies, and no fortress of control could sever what they had built together. The city, the threats, the rival families, they didn't matter in this moment because everything came down to one undeniable fact. She was carrying his child, his blood, his legacy. Adrian's mind raced, spiraling into memories he had buried. The first time she laughed at something he said. The quiet mornings they had shared. The nights when she fell asleep in his arms, unaware of the battles he fought outside their home. The warmth of her hands, the softness of her voice, the small ordinary things that had been extraordinary to him. Now seeing her instinctively protect the life inside her, he realized she had been protecting him all along, protecting him even in the moments he had pushed her away. The ache in his chest grew unbearable. He wanted to cross the street, to reach her, to hold her like nothing else in the world existed. But fear held him back. Fear of the enemies who still lurked. Fear of the lies that had been told. Fear of what had already been set in motion. Even as he stood there frozen, Adrian knew one thing. Denial wasn't an option anymore. Not when the truth was written in every careful movement, every instinctive gesture, every silent heartbeat that echoed in the space between them. Elena was his. The child she carried was his. And whatever distance, whatever lies, whatever sacrifices had separated them, none of it mattered anymore because fate had finally caught up. And Adrian Vale, the man who controlled everything, had no control over what his heart had just recognized. Their eyes met, and in that single glance, the world shifted. Shock, fear, recognition. Elena froze for a fraction of a second, her hand still resting lightly over her stomach. Adrian saw it. The instinctive gesture, the protective motion he had known for years. It wasn't casual. It wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Her eyes widened as they locked with his. There was no denial in them, no question, no misdirection. Just raw, undeniable truth. Elena didn't run. She didn't turn away. She didn't smile. Even though a part of him ached for her to do just that, she just stood there, exposed yet steady, the sunlight catching the faint curve of her belly, soft lines of her face hardened by months of survival. And then she spoke. "You weren't supposed to see me like this," she said quietly, almost as if she were confessing a sin, though there was no shame in her tone, only the weight of what had been kept hidden. Adrian's throat went dry, his chest tightened. He stepped forward without thinking, yet stopped when he realized how impossible this moment was, how fragile, how devastating. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to reach her, to claim what he had lost. But reason, the same cold reason that had made him divorce her, stayed his feet. The city was still dangerous. They were both vulnerable. And yet nothing mattered more than the truth now standing before him. His mind raced. Every plan, every lie, every carefully constructed wall he had built around his heart, all crumbled in the face of that single revelation. It was hers, their child, his. He wanted to reach for her hand, to place his fingers over hers on her stomach, to feel the small life growing there, to know that no matter how far he had pushed her away, part of him had survived inside her. But he hesitated. Fear gripped him, not of enemies, not of loss, but of failure, of misreading her, of frightening her. Yet, as Elena's gaze stayed locked on his, steady and unflinching, he knew the child was his, everything else faded. The months of absence, the lies he had told, the calculated distance. In that instant, nothing mattered except what was real and undeniable. He remembered the first night he had held her in his arms. The first time he had whispered promises he never intended to keep. All of it. Every regret, every choice, every sacrifice led him here. Elena's presence was a reminder of what he had lost. Her pregnancy was a promise of what he could never lose again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them continued, oblivious. The city carried on with its noise, its traffic, its indifference. But for Adrian, nothing existed except Elena and the life she carried. Finally, he spoke quietly, carefully. "I didn't know," he said. Not a confession, not an excuse, just a fragment of truth, stripped of all pretense. Elena nodded barely, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't angry, she wasn't pleading. She was cautious, protective, like a lioness guarding her cub. And in that moment, Adrian understood something essential. He hadn't lost her entirely, he had only been away. But fate, unyielding, relentless, had brought him back to the truth he had tried so hard to avoid. The child was his. And knowing that, Adrian Vale felt something he hadn't felt in months, a spark of hope. Not a light that would blind him, not a miracle that would erase the past, but a quiet, undeniable proof that some things, even in Ravenport, even amidst lies and violence, could not be taken away. The moment was fragile, precious, dangerous, but it was theirs. And Adrian knew with every fiber of his being that nothing would ever be the same again. Because now there was a life, his life, their life, tied irrevocably to Elena. And that truth could not be denied. Adrian Vale had always been defined by control, by precision, by the ability to predict, manipulate, and eliminate threats before they became problems. He thrived on it. It was what made him feared, respected, untouchable. But now, none of it mattered. He had pushed her away, built walls, spun lies, all to protect her from the world he ruled with blood and whispers. He had thought he was doing the right thing, the only thing that could keep her alive. And yet here she was standing before him, pregnant, vulnerable, strong, and Adrian realized, with a gut-deep jolt, that he might have saved her, only to lose everything anyway. The fear wasn't just for her, it was for the child. For the life he had no right to touch, yet couldn't help wanting to. For the fragile thread connecting them, so easily broken, so perilously exposed in a city that never forgave weakness. Every step she took, every glance she spared, reminded him how close he had come to failing completely, how easily fate could have snatched her away before he ever had the chance to reconcile. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, and realized he wasn't afraid of enemies. Not tonight, not anymore. He was afraid of the consequences of his own hesitation, the consequences of silence, of the months he had allowed himself to believe that distance could protect her. Adrian had survived every threat the city had thrown at him, rival families, betrayals, assassins. But this was a danger he couldn't outmaneuver with money, power, or intimidation. The danger was time. The danger was destiny. Because destiny doesn't forgive hesitation. And he had hesitated. He had waited, calculated, lied, believed that doing nothing from a distance would be enough to shield her. But now, looking at her, feeling the pulse of life against her body that was his, Adrian realized just how fragile control truly was. Fear coursed through him like a living thing, hot, sharp, relentless. What if something had already happened in those 6 months? What if someone had noticed? What if she had been hurt and he hadn't known? What if he had been too late? Adrian paced in place, fists clenching and unclenching, trying to breathe through it. Logic told him to step back, to observe, to plan. But instinct, the primal part of him that had loved her long before power and fear defined him, screamed for action. He wanted to move, to protect, to reclaim. But fear was heavier than rage. He didn't want to break her world. He didn't want to frighten her. He didn't want to push her into hiding again. And yet, he knew he had to because he couldn't allow the city or anyone else to touch what was now undeniably his. Adrian's mind ran through possibilities, contingencies, escape plans, and safe havens. Every move had to be calculated, every step precise. One mistake could undo months of careful preparation. One moment of hesitation could cost more than his life. It could cost hers. He had always controlled everything. Always. But fear reminded him that some things, some people could never be controlled. Not Elena, not their child. And for the first time, Adrian Vale understood something he had never admitted aloud. He was powerless to protect what mattered most unless he confronted the truth head-on. Fear had replaced rage. And it was far more dangerous because rage can be fought, controlled, directed. Fear, sharp and intimate, burrows deep into the heart. It whispers of loss, of failure, of inevitability. It doesn't let go. And tonight that fear would drive him, force him, compel him to act, to reclaim, to save her. This time for good before destiny decided it was too late. Because hesitation was no longer an option, Adrian followed her from a distance. Not close enough to be noticed, not close enough to disturb her, but close enough to see every step, every movement, every small detail that could signal danger. Months of silence, lies, and separation had not changed one truth. She was still his. Even divorced, even in a world where he had told himself she was safer apart. Even after all the sacrifices, all the calculated cruelty, all the distance, she moved through South Ravenport with cautious purpose, unaware of the shadow tracking her. The small clinics, the quiet streets, the minimal interactions with the world, all deliberate, all protective, but Adrian couldn't leave it to chance. He stayed in the background, watching, analyzing, anticipating. A car parked across the street, a pedestrian slowing too long, a glance that could be a threat. Every detail mattered. Every movement of hers was catalogued, weighed, and assessed for danger. She was his responsibility, whether she knew it or not. Every instinct he had ever relied on, every lesson in power, in control, in fear was now focused on her, on protecting her without ever revealing himself, because she didn't need him here. She didn't want him here. And more importantly, she didn't need to know. That was part of the promise he had made. Even when it hurt him to watch from afar, Adrian knew that love sometimes meant silence. Sometimes it meant walking in shadows while the person you cherished moved freely, thinking they were alone. He followed her to a small cafe, then a pharmacy, then finally to a park bench near a fountain, each step carefully measured, each risk anticipated, when a man lingered too long nearby. Adrian's hand brushed the concealed gun at his hip. Not to shoot, not yet, but to remind himself that he was ready, that nothing would touch her while he was near. Minutes became hours, and though she never glanced around, he noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the instinctive way she kept her hand over her stomach, the way her eyes scanned the world. She was still cautious, still vigilant, still alive. He wanted to tell her to relax, to trust, to let him in, but that would ruin everything. So he stayed watching, protecting, breathing silently in the shadow of the city that had made him both feared and unstoppable. Adrian's mind wandered to months past. The divorce papers, the lies, the carefully constructed distance. He had believed that removing himself from her life would keep her safe, that hiding his love and his presence was protection. But destiny had other plans. And now, even separated by law and circumstance, the thread connecting them was unbroken. Every glance he caught of her reminded him she was still his. Not in the world's eyes, not on paper, but in every essential, unchangeable way. She carried his child. She carried the past they had shared. And whether she realized it or not, she carried a piece of his heart with her every moment. And Adrian would follow that thread as long as it took, as long as it kept her safe, even divorced, even unacknowledged, even untouchable. Because some bonds, some destinies couldn't be erased. And this one, the one tied to Elena and their unborn child, was unbreakable. He would protect her from the shadows. He would fight unseen threats. He would endure every second of longing without revealing himself. Because love sometimes demanded patience, restraint, and sacrifice. And even if the world thought they were apart, Adrian Vale knew the truth. She was still his. Patient and unyielding would ensure that the thread never snapped. Eventually, silence broke. Not by accident, not by chance, but because some truths, no matter how long buried, demand to be spoken. "You left me," Elena said, voice steady, but trembling beneath the surface. Her eyes wide and fierce, locked onto his. "You didn't give me a choice." Adrian didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He had faced enemies who smiled as they bled, men who whispered threats seconds before death, and yet her words cut deeper than any bullet ever could. "I gave you life," he answered, voice low, controlled, but carrying the weight of months he could no longer contain. Elena's gaze narrowed. She took a careful step closer, hand instinctively cradling the small curve of her stomach. "And took love," she said. The words weren't loud, but they hit with surgical precision. Adrian felt the truth of them like fire in his chest. Every plan he had made, every lie, every distance he had imposed suddenly meaningless against the raw reality of what he had lost. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It wasn't rage, nor could it be justified with his usual cold logic. It was pain, deep, suffocating, undeniable pain. Elena's words echoed in the air around them, more lethal than any weapon. He wanted to argue, to explain, to justify the sacrifices he had made. But he couldn't, not fully, because every syllable she had spoken was true. He had taken love from her. He had left. He had lied. He had erased himself from her life, all in the name of protection. And yet protection came at a cost. A cost he could now see in the tilt of her head, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes burned with the betrayal he had inflicted. Adrian's hand twitched, nearly reaching for her, nearly bridging the months of distance, the chasm of pain. But he stayed his motion, not yet. Not until she understood that every action he had taken had been for her safety, for hers and the child's. "You think I left," he said finally, voice tight with emotion, and he rarely allowed himself to feel. "You think it was abandonment. I gave you life. I gave you every chance to survive without me. Every moment I wasn't there, it was because I couldn't risk it all." Elena's chest rose and fell, breath shallow but steady. Her voice didn't waver. "You left my heart behind anyway." The words cut deeper than he expected. He had prepared for confrontation, for anger, for accusations, but not for truth delivered so simply, so perfectly that it mirrored his own torment. He swallowed, his jaw tightening. "I tried to protect you from me, from this world, from everything I am. And I wanted you," she said softly, dangerously. "I didn't care about the world, I wanted you. I wanted us. But you chose safety over love. You left me to survive alone." Silence fell again, heavier this time. The kind of silence where both people know nothing they say can undo the past, where everything unspoken hangs like smoke, thick and inevitable. Adrian's chest ached, not from fear, not from power, not from control, but from the unbearable weight of having caused the only pain he had ever feared to inflict. That hurt more than any bullet, more than betrayal, more than death itself, because bullets heal, betrayals fade, death ends. But this, the destruction of love between them, torn apart by lies meant to protect, was permanent unless they could rebuild, and rebuilding would require truth. Adrian and Elena stood there facing each other, a lifetime of choices and consequences stretching between them. A war of silence and unspoken emotions, of sacrifices and regrets, of love and fear, and both knew the confrontation was only the beginning, because nothing would ever be the same again, and nothing would ever be easy. Adrian did the unthinkable, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the precision of a man who had spent his life controlling everything, and realized that control meant nothing without what truly mattered. He stepped away from power, not permanently, not as a surrender, but enough to make room for something that had been impossible for years. Trust from control. Every carefully constructed rule, every calculated move, every empire built on fear and silence. He left it all behind, if only temporarily. He set it aside like a weapon he no longer needed because the danger he feared most wasn't outside anymore. It was in his heart. It was the possibility of losing Elena and their child, the life they now carried together. Adrian had always believed he was defined by what he could protect, by what he could dominate, by the lines he drew between loyalty and death. And yet, for the first time, he realized that untouchable didn't mean safe. Not for her, not for their child. He made the choice that terrified him the most. To let go of the life that had shaped him and step into uncertainty. For the first time, he chose faith over fear. Faith in Elena, faith in the child. Faith in something bigger than control, bigger than power, bigger than revenge or survival. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't naive. It was intentional. He knew there would be consequences. Shadows he couldn't see. Enemies who might strike while he was distracted. Plans that could unravel if he let his guard down for even a second. But Adrian understood something essential. Fear, left unchecked, would never allow him to live or to love. He approached Elena slowly, hands empty, eyes open, heart unshielded in a way he hadn't allowed since the first night they met. "I can't protect you by hiding anymore," he said, voice low but steady. "I can't keep you safe by staying away. Not when this exists," he said, gesturing toward her stomach. "Not when we exist." Elena's eyes searched him, suspicion and hope warring in their depths. She had learned to expect the unexpected from Adrian Vale. But this was something new, vulnerability, a willingness to risk everything for love instead of control. "You're choosing us," she asked softly. "Yes," he admitted. The single word carried years of regret, months of lies, and the weight of a decision that could change everything. "I'm choosing you, choosing faith over fear, choosing this life with you." For the first time, Adrian Vale allowed himself to imagine a future not dictated by violence or strategy, but by connection, by presence, by love. The tension that had defined every interaction for months, the distance, the secrets, the unspoken threats began to melt. Not entirely, not yet, but enough that hope could slip in. Elena didn't speak immediately. She studied him, cautious yet not unkind. And in her silence, Adrian felt the fragile thread of trust start to rebuild. This choice wasn't a surrender. It was a commitment, a leap into the unknown. And as he stepped closer, letting his shadow mingle with hers, letting his hands hover near the curve of her belly without fear or hesitation, he realized something profound. The greatest power he had ever held wasn't fear, control, or even survival. It was the courage to choose love fully and without restraint. And in that choice, Adrian Vale discovered something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The world could still be dangerous. Rivals could still plot. The city could still demand ruthlessness. But for the first time, Adrian understood that nothing outside mattered more than what he was choosing to protect inside: Elena, their child, and the life they would face together. Faith over fear, love over control, Elena over everything else. And for Adrian, that was a decision worth everything. Adrian didn't promise perfection. He couldn't. Not after months of lies, not after pushing her away, not after showing her a man who could protect everything in Ravenport except what he loved most. But he promised presence. Every word he spoke, every step he took toward her, every hand he placed near hers carried one truth: he would be there. Not just as a shadow in the background, not as a protector she couldn't see, but fully openly as himself. Elena didn't forgive him easily. She studied him, questioned him, tested the sincerity behind the words he had spent months perfecting. Her trust had been broken. Her heart had been wounded. Her life had carried weight she hadn't asked for, all because of the choices he had made in her name. And Adrian understood. He waited. He answered only when necessary. He acted only when needed. He let her see him. Slowly, cautiously, proving that presence wasn't just a promise. It was action. Every morning he stayed near. Every quiet gesture, every shared glance, every protective instinct made visible became the bridge back to what they had lost. Destiny had already decided. Some love doesn't end. Some love doesn't fade. No matter the distance, the lies, or the passage of time, it waits patiently, relentlessly. And when fate brings it back, it comes with a heartbeat. The first time Adrian held her hand again, it wasn't just his strength. It was the pulse of reassurance, the rhythm of what had never truly been broken. The first time he brushed his lips against her hair, it wasn't just affection. It was the promise of protection, of fidelity, of presence that no danger could erase. When Elena finally allowed herself to lean into him, the surrender was not to perfection. It was to honesty, to the undeniable connection that had existed long before fear and lies had intervened. She let him in, not because he had made her, but because she saw him choosing her. Every day, every moment, every decision, the child they carried became the symbol of that redemption. Not just a life growing quietly, innocently between them, but the living proof that love, even when tested to its limits, survives. Adrian didn't need to promise the world. He didn't need to promise safety or control or dominance over every shadow in Ravenport. He only needed to promise this, that he would be present. And in the presence of that promise, Elena began to rebuild, to heal, to trust. Not all scars disappear. Some remain as reminders of what was endured. But scars also prove survival. And survival meant a future. A future where Adrian Vale and Elena Cross could exist together. Not as husband and wife in a legal sense. Not as figures in a power struggle, but as two people bound by a force far greater than fear, violence, or circumstance. A love that had been tested by betrayal, sacrifice, and danger. A love that had waited. A love that had returned. Adrian watched her one evening, sunlight spilling over the city skyline, and realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about showing up every day, even when it was hard, even when it scared him, even when the world demanded otherwise. He had failed before, but he would not fail again. Not her, not their child, not their life together. And in that moment, with Elena by his side, hand in hand, and a new life growing between them, Adrian Vale understood something he had always known in his soul, but had finally allowed himself to feel. Some love doesn't end. It waits, and when it returns, it comes with a heartbeat. A heartbeat that changes everything. A heartbeat that cannot be ignored. A heartbeat that is worth fighting for. For life, for love, for destiny itself. Adrian didn't promise perfection. He promised presence. And for Elena, that was more than enough. Some love doesn't end when the papers are signed. Some love stays quiet, waiting for the moment fate brings it back.